is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept. There can be no end save victory.
I'm Sarah Kensier, and I'm a journalist and scholar of authoritarian states. I'm also the author of the book, The View from Flyover Country.
I'm Andrea Chalupa. I'm a writer, activist, and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of Agnieszka Holland's upcoming journalistic thriller, Gareth Jones. Someone reached out to us over our Twitter and said, Andrea, you promote Sarah's book more than you promote your own film.
I will promote your film then. Everyone should go see Andrea's film, which deals with journalists who are covering Stalin's era and the famine in Ukraine.
All right. It's not even out yet. We're still fighting over the final cut. It's not out yet. So yeah, you can.
This is a film that's set in another era, but it completely reflects the political problems of our own era. I saw the trailer and I got teary-eyed, and I'm not the type who cries at stuff like this, but it was really moving. It was brilliantly done. I've read the script. I endorse this, not just because Andrea is my friend, but because it's really, really good. So go see Gareth Jones when it comes out. Welcome to Gaslit Nation, a self-promoting podcast that examines corruption in the Trump administration and rising authoritarianism around the world. And so today, later in the episode, we have an interview with Michael Weiss, a foreign policy expert who focuses on Russia. But first, we're going to start by talking about some of the atrocities right here in the US. Yesterday, the Trump administration announced that they are, quote, defining transgender out of existence. According to the New York Times, the department argued in its memo that key government agencies needed to adopt an explicit and uniform definition of gender as determined, quote, on a biological basis that is clear, grounded in science, objective, and administrable. The agency's proposed definitions would define sex as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with, according to a draft reviewed by the Times. Any dispute about one's sex would have to be clarified using genetic testing. So, there are all sorts of atrocious things about this policy. I really don't like the kind of discussion I've seen online where people say, oh, this is a distraction. This is something that Trump is doing to, rile up liberals before the midterms. First of all, that's nonsense. This is part of an ongoing attack on transgender people. We saw earlier with the military, and no policy that hurts human beings is a distraction. By its definition, it's a policy worthy of attention. What's also notable here is that this kind of targeting of a minuscule and malign group that already faces a lot of prejudice is very typical for a rising dictatorship. You saw this in Nazi Germany with attacks on gays and lesbians and transgendered people then. It's an issue that you should pay attention to because trans people are being hurt. And you should also care about it as a sign of increasing autocracy in the US because it's not going to stop there.
Yeah, it is going to get worse. And in this world, the greatest struggle is to be yourself and surround yourself with people who absolutely adore you and love you for being yourself. And just imagine that battle, and also coming out as transgender, making that transition in America under Trump. Yeah, no, my heart breaks from this story. And I'm also at the same time incredibly inspired by the courage of anyone who can be part of the change we desperately need in this country to just give greater voice to what it means to be transgender, and the harassment and the suicide rates and everything, the whole struggle of what they face. And it's just disgusting to me what Trump is doing. And it's a lot like how he's demonizing the people who are flooding from war zones and famine, coming to our country and coming to the border with Mexico. And it's gross. All of it is very gross.
It's cruelty for cruelty's sake. And like you said, it's another example of people who are abused being presented to the public as a threat, which they are not. And I want to read a little bit of a thread from Parker Malloy, who is a journalist who is trans, and she's a great person to follow on these issues. She was responding to people asking what they could do to fight back. And she says, lots of people are asking what they can do to fight back against the Trump administration's planned anti-trans actions. The answer, honestly, is to elect Democrats. Let me explain why. There's a bill that's been floating around Congress for a bit called the Equality Act. Before that, there is the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. What it would do, basically, is amend the Civil Rights Act to include gender identity and sexual orientation alongside race, color, religion, national origin, sex, age, disability, veteran status, genetic information, and citizenship. Now, opponents of this like to frame these as special rights or extra rights, but this addition would literally just be giving LGBTQ the same rights and legal protection everybody else already has. Nothing special or extra about these rights, only equal. And then she goes on to describe how the bill already has 198 co-sponsors in the House. Only 2 of them are Republicans. The other 196 are Democrats. Because the GOP controls the House, the bill has not made it out of committee. If the makeup of Congress changes on November 6th, there's a chance that those sorts of protections can actually be extended and this bill can actually pass. And I thought this was a really important thread, and I encourage you to read her other threads just about what this means for trans Americans in general, and also look up other trans writers who are writing about this. Andrea and I are not the main sources on this issue. We really encourage you to look for people with greater expertise. But one of the points I like that she makes is that, this is not about voting for the Democrats to screw over Trump. This is not about voting for the Democrats to just get some kind of win for the sake of winning. This is about people's real lives. This is about their freedom, about their rights, their dignity. In the case of trans Americans, this is an issue that, if Trump passes this bill, you're going to see a rise in suicides. Lives are on the line here. And that's true for a lot of bills that are basically lying in wait because the GOP Congress won't pass them. We have bills on climate change, bills on healthcare. There's a bill to protect the Mueller probe is one of the things, most likely to actually get Trump and other criminal members of this administration out of office. There is a bill from Ted Lieu that will limit Trump's ability to unilaterally launch nuclear weapons. These are life and death issues. So when you're casting your votes, I do encourage you to vote Democrat down the line. And, I'm not a registered Democrat. I'm an independent. But it is so obvious that in terms of our rights, our freedom, our ability to make decisions for our own lives, the Democratic Party is the party that is willing to listen to people on these issues. It is willing to be persuaded in a direction that is far more humane than the Republicans, who are primarily concerned with enacting a one-party state and protecting themselves from criminal litigation. And so, when you vote, don't just think about the candidate. Think about the makeup of Congress and what can be possible if there is an actual blue wave on November 6th.
It's a matter of human rights. We have several human rights crises created by the Trump regime, created by Ivanka Trump, created by Jared Kushner, created by that whole cabal of Trumps that are in power, including the son's, Don Jr., who's going around free, a free man, not indicted yet, even though he's got that smoking cannon of the quid pro quo with the Trump Tower meeting, campaigning for Republicans. Trump is obsessively getting out the vote. He's traveling constantly. Cable news is following him around. We've got that same Trump reality show going as we saw in 2016. His tweets are sending the media into a feeding frenzy. Trump is really making this election about Trump. And so all of us have to see this election clearly, and it's about human rights. It is about taking back the House and taking back the Senate so we can not only, protect trans people, but it's also about restoring voting laws. It's also about uniting children with their families, with their parents that were stripped away from each other at the border so cruelly. It's a human rights election.
Speaking of human rights, I guess, and the possibility of not only losing our rights, but our lives. Nuclear Armageddon. This is an issue. I've been writing about this for a long time. I've had a lot of people naysaying me about this for a long time.
You have as big of a nuke fetish as Trump himself, I would even say.
I do not. I am on guard, y'all. I am keeping an eye on this. And it's not just me. All the nuclear scientists are yeah, you're right. And this is a huge problem. The people who seem to dismiss it are mostly just kind of Kremlin lackey types, Glenn Greenwald accused me of being a cult leader because I keep talking about my desire for no one to use nuclear weapons, which I guess if you're, into blowing the world into obliteration, then I guess you would disagree with me that this is an important thing to follow. But Trump announced that he is going to be pulling out of the INF treaty with Russia. The INF treaty was what banned intermediate-range nuclear and conventional missiles. It was signed in 1987 by Reagan and Gorbachev. 1987 was the year that Trump proclaimed that he knew everything there was to know about nuclear weapons because he learned it within an hour and a half. He had a long-standing interest in nukes dating back to 1984. He had wanted to be the person to negotiate with the Soviet Union about the use of nuclear weapons at the suggestion of his mentor, mafia lawyer, and just general scumbag Roy Cohn, that he began to pursue this. It was after his trip to the Soviet Union that his interest intensified. And with Trump, it was not about non-proliferation. He wanted to know, as he repeated in 2016, if we have them, why aren't we using them? He talked about nuking France. He talked about nuking Pakistan. He's in a position where he can actually do this. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't need Congress to enact war. He can unilaterally launch a nuclear weapon. And now he has John Bolton next to him, who also has talked rapturously about wanting to launch nuclear weapons. And so there's a misperception about them pulling out of this treaty that's being spread by people who like to think that Trump and Russia are actually at war and that annoying people like me and Andrea who keep talking about Kremlin interference are the cause of that. That's wrong. This is not a competition between Trump and the Kremlin. It is a collaboration. They're not going to war with each other, but going to war together, possibly against another country, given that Bolton is there and has been fantasizing about bombing Iran, including with preemptive strikes. I would guess that that's a likely target. They are kleptocrats. They are planning to enrich themselves by developing a massive weapons stockpile in tandem. You might remember from, I believe it was the Helsinki summit, where they just sat there and said, hey, between the two of us, we have 90% of the world's nuclear stockpile, which is a sentiment that assured absolutely no one. Just kind of leaves you thinking like, well, what is going to kill us? Is it going to be climate change, or are we going to get nuked first? Like, those are the questions now occupying our minds as we head into, as you said, the human rights election. So I'll just read one thing because I wrote this 2 years ago. I was greatly maligned for writing it. This is an article I wrote for Quartz called Trump and Putin, the Worst Case Scenario. I'm just going to read the conclusion to kind of drive this point home again. Given Trump's affection for and connection to the Kremlin, one the Kremlin itself has confirmed, and the fact that the US and Russia have now promoted nearly identical foreign policies and also appear to be pursuing a series of financial agreements in the gas and oil industry that benefit billionaires of both states, it is unlikely that the US is preparing to engage in a nuclear arms race against Russia. Trump may have found the nuclear partner in Putin he's been seeking for decades. In Trump, Putin may have found a willing accomplice who will back Russian imperialistic ambitions and drop sanctions, among other benefits. This is the new mutually assured destruction. The two states with the most nuclear weapons in the world, both backed by authoritarian leaders, may be partnering against as yet unknown shared enemies. Their rhetoric alone is dangerous, and an actual increase in nuclear arsenals more so. In a worst-case scenario, the end target of Trump and Putin's destructive ambitions could ultimately be the entire world.
Somebody wrote some viral thread saying, the alarmists were right. The rest of us were conformist suckers. And it's like, there's zero pleasure at all in being right, especially when so many lives have been destroyed by this regime. And I just wanted to tell the people out there who, if anybody at any point got that feeling of, yeah, let's just burn it all down and rebuild, it is extremely difficult to rebuild. Europe needed a Marshall Plan in order to rebuild. And a decade after the World War II ended, France was so poor it tried to sell itself to England. So it's like never, ever, ever be on the side of let's burn it down, because that's really what we're up against. That's what our enemy wants to do. The enemy wants destruction. The enemy wants to usher in some evangelical apocalypse. The Republican Party is the party of death. They want to take away our health care. They want to essentially kill children or threaten death for children on the border that come here fleeing war. They want to continue polluting and killing the planet. The GOP stands for absolutely nothing but death. Like, that's what we're up against. And so Democrats, we have to be the party of building, building, and building, and never stop building. We're building a progressive future. We're building a 50-state progressive strategy. We're going to be running people in every single district to make sure that voting rights, trans rights, human rights are a reality in America, and that we're finally stabilizing our democracy after too many years of Koch brothers and the Mercers polluting this place. And I do want to say about nuclear war specifically, this is a reality show of dictators. Putin's turned Russian television into a fever dream reality show. Trump has turned cable news in America into his own reality show. And all this is some scam. They're saber-rattling nuclear war to try to intimidate their shared opponents. Remember, Trump and Putin talk on the phone regularly. Putin's in Trump's ears. And this is the same as like that fake standoff between Kim Jong-un that ended up in a surreal photo op of Trump shaking hands, legitimizing the mass murdering dictator of North Korea. We saw this like in the weeks leading up to the 2016 election, where Putin did this massive nuclear drill in Russia, preparing the Russians, the Russian military for nuclear war. And now he's saying that, Russians that die in a nuclear Armageddon are going to go straight to heaven. He's just acting hysterical. And Trump is playing along. He loves this. He loves the theatrics of it. He loves the power of it. He loves the intimidation of it. And you even saw, like in the weeks leading up to the election, when Putin was running all these nuclear preparation drills, you had Trump saying that Hillary Clinton was going to lead us to war. You had Jill Stein, Putin's other candidate in the 2016 election, saying that Hillary is going to lead us to war with Russia. And all of this is to intimidate people, intimidate Europeans included, from backing down and not enacting further sanctions, which are necessary by now. And Trump is loving it.
Trump legit wants to nuke stuff. I think he's fantasized about nuking things. Like, he doesn't have value for human life. He doesn't have any sense of what that destruction will be. He just knows he will be the president that can do this. He will be the first president that, did it to a certain country or place. So I think the fear of it is legitimate, particularly with Bolton on board. These are not people who, value human life. As you were saying before, the Republicans have become the party of death. And the reason that I keep harping on it so much is because I want this to be stopped. I think that these amendments to stop him from having this power need to be passed. I think he needs to be taken out of office, particularly given his temperament. I think that if he feels cornered and he feels that he's losing, rather than lose, he will destroy the world instead. And I hope I'm wrong about everything. That could be the other motto of our show, along with "it was in the public domain," is I hope we're wrong.
And that's actually a really great tagline for Gaslit Nation. We hope we're wrong. Coming to a t-shirt near you.
Yeah, we should. All right. Well, speaking of even more horrifying and shitty things happening, we are still talking about Jamal Khashoggi, which is, it's interesting to me that this story is still in the news, because we're used to having these news cycles for like the last 2 years that are basically 24 hours long, where it's just one atrocity on top of another, and then we move on to something else. But this has really stuck with people. This has really affected people. The latest in that story as of today is that the Saudis have killed him. They've admitted this. It looks like MBS hired a body double to pretend to be Khashoggi. This is according to video obtained by Turkey. They have a look-alike in the video wearing his clothes, and it was implied in an article on CNN that they hacked up the body and put it in a plastic bag and sent this alleged doppelganger out. Some have hypothesized that they were possibly going to say he was jailed instead of murdered and mutilated, and then that was going to be their way of covering it up. But yeah, this is a deeply frightening and horrifying story. I don't know. I'm out of words. I'm just thinking of him and his family and his loved ones. And
this has to trigger the Magnitsky sanctions. That's what the Magnitsky sanctions are for. It's anybody that was involved in the murder of an investigative journalist needs to be sanctioned inside the royal family and their associates. And Jared, of course, being literally a slumber party buddy of the Crown Prince. The Washington Post ran an article saying that MBS and Jared stayed up till like 4 a.m. on several nights. These two millennial, deeply privileged, young, untested men mapping out their corners of the world, essentially. And it's incredibly dangerous. And it reminds me of that stupid slogan the Republicans just tried to roll out. As one of our listeners pointed out, it sounds like the headline for one of our shows, #jobs, not mobs. When I saw that, I thought it was, we want green jobs, not the mafia in power, not Jared Kushner in power. And it turns out that no, that's what idiot Mitch McConnell thought would work as a slogan, even though it sums up what we desperately want in this country, which is green jobs to put these gas station dictatorships out of power, to absolutely cripple them. The Democratic Party needs to put out a widespread rule that you will not support your run for office unless you support a robust, aggressive, green economy to wean the world off of oil, because that is a deep-rooting factor of the human rights crises of our time, which is, of course, what's going on in the Middle East with these dictatorships, what's going on with Russia, which is also a gas station country, and Venezuela as well, which has a massive famine that's killing innocent Venezuelans and creating a refugee crisis there. So the sooner we wean the world off oil, the better. And the Democratic Party, if you want to inspire people, because, we do have these midterms, and these midterms are really community-driven. It's a lot of fed-up women that see Trump say he could be president of the United States and I can be a state rep in my state. And this is really not the Democratic Party leading this revolution, this blue wave that is hopefully headed to the polls on November 6th. We're seeing massive early voting numbers, but that, as we saw in 2016, can't really predict anything. but the numbers do look hopeful so far. But that's not the party establishment driving that. That's the grassroots, that's local communities. It's people who are fighting for their lives right now, fighting for the lives of people they love. And really, the Democratic Party, if it has any sense, across the board, our platform is to take down these dictatorships by making America the leader in the green economy, green jobs, green energy.
It improves human rights, it improves the economy, it creates jobs, it stops some of the damage of climate change. Like, it seems like a no-brainer, but since the GOP has no brains, I guess that's probably why it's not happening.
Yeah, and they need to own the fact that the Democrats are the party of science and human rights. I know it's not catchy, it's like democracy, not dictatorship, hashtag, but it's like they have to own the fact that, as Andrew Gillum did in the debate for Florida governor, he challenged his GOP opponent, pointed out that he doesn't believe in science. And that's really what we're up against. It reminds me a lot of like the trial of Galileo. We're up against people who have a serious problem with facts. We really need the brain trust of the tens of millions of liberals in this country. There's more of us than there are of them. We just have this stupid backwards system that they take advantage of. That's a legacy of slavery in America, the Electoral College, of course. We really need the liberal brain trust out there to step up and be massively proud of their talents and not afraid to use them and join communities. Keep in mind that communities are leaders now. Don't wait for any messiah politician or organization to save you. All of us are leading ourselves out of this. Sarah and I started a podcast without knowing any idea what we're doing. Like, we still don't.
Not that you can tell.
We've had so many amazing episodes aborted because one of us, I'm not going to say which one, but one of us likes to spit in the face of technology and forgot to record or something. But yeah, so look at us, we're still going. So all of this is about self-reliance. All of this is about everybody standing up and being counted. And it's going to take a lot of hard work and years of commitment. The blue wave, as Stacey Abrams said, is about creating the country that we want. And it's not about the midterms. It's about looking way past the midterms and staying engaged, staying informed, and working towards the issues locally that you care about.
I feel like the alt-right basically tried to co-opt this because I kind of saw people saying that before. And of course, the description of Trump as a mafia front has increased a lot. It, of course, existed in all of Wayne Barrett's work and was in the public domain for the last 30 years, but magically forgotten in 2015 and 2016. But people have been talking about Trump's mob ties. And I think that, the Trump administration's trying to take back the word, assign it to Democrats, drain it of its power. But, we know that they're mafia and our slogan is better. So, yeah. But yeah, we're not going to win this through rhetoric and slogans. We will win this through votes.
Through hard work and commitment. I actually, because I was feeling really, obviously, like all of us, really stressed out, I needed to do something about that desperately. So I took up boxing. And it felt amazing. So I lasted an hour in a boxing gym, just smacking into things.
You should do Gaslit Nation self-care, because I spent the weekend chopping up rocks. I went geode hunting and was chopping up stuff with a pickaxe and getting all of
it sounds like
my
heaven.
anger out on there. So yeah, it's all, self-improvement. We're like Goop, but for authoritarian survivors. So
Gaslit Nation branded pickaxes. That's next.
Oh yes, that's what we should have.
I highly recommend it. It really exercises the Kavanaugh toxins out of your system. I felt ready to take on the world. If I can survive a 1-hour boxing class, we can rebuild America. I think all news shows have to talk about self-care and mental illness. We have an opioid crisis in America. We have a Ivanka Trump crisis in America. It's we have to have these mental health check-ins. It's the new weather report. You just need those check-ins regularly. So we're going to be this is part of our series of looking back on 2016 and how we got here. And the subject is President Obama's foreign policy and how that contributed to the rise of Trump. And really, if Donald Trump is president of the United States and he got there through the help of the Kremlin, then something was wrong with your foreign policy. That takes some of the responsibility of how we ended up here. And I know some people might be thinking, why are you focusing on Obama? Why are you putting Obama in a bad light, especially right before such a critical midterm? Well, the good news is Obama is not the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is all of us, we're the leaders, every single one of us of the Democratic Party, and we're reforming it. It's about communities leading. And it's important for us to, of course, take stock, because I know from being a Ukrainian American activist and writer focused on Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and before that, of course, the revolution in Ukraine, I was stunned. I knew from talking to people connected or inside the Obama administration that Putin just was not a priority. Obama, obviously had so much to clean up. He had the economic meltdown of 2008. He had Bush's based on lies invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so he had a lot on his watch that happened. And in addition to that, he had essentially a cyclone rip through the world and completely destabilize it, including, of course, the Arab Spring, which contributed to the worst refugee crisis, a refugee crisis that has surpassed World War II. So Obama had a lot happen on his watch, and we're still dealing with a massive amount of fallout. It was difficult, but he should have prioritized Putin more. He should not have underestimated Putin. I mean, I enjoyed some of the smack talking he did, making fun of the size of Putin's economy. That felt good at the time. But what Putin showed us was it's not how big you are, it's how big you want to be. And if you have a black sense of humor, you could really see Putin's last few years as one of the greatest comeback stories, underdog stories ever. This conversation is incredibly important to have. It's necessary cold water to splash on our faces. And it's an important reminder to the left that you need a strong foreign policy. You need to invest in programs to help investigative journalists and reformers on the front lines, risking their lives, risking their livelihood in countries like Ukraine. That's who led the revolution. It was the investigative journalists that were supported by Western grants in NGOs. And that's what Putin has vilified. He's passed a law that criminalizes NGOs. He kicked out George Soros's foundations. And you see people on the left picking up on this Kremlin rhetoric, saying that the West interferes in these democracies through our NGOs. I can't even understand that justification of why we shouldn't give people like my friends in Kiev who face death threats, who face harassment, doing their jobs as journalists. So I think that is not only selfish, but it just goes against human rights. You have to support a free, strong press in these developing democracies, because if you don't, corruption is going to just take over, and you're going to get more dictatorships that you then have to contend with, and the dictatorship mold spreads further around the world.
The other thing to remember is that it's not just about Obama as an individual. He was not a dictator. He was not unilaterally forming a policy. My frustration was with the administration itself, with the State Department, with the intel agencies. Everyone dropped the ball when it came to Russia. I remember during the sequester, when study of Russia and Central Asia was heavily defunded in 2013. And then, of course, in 2014, we get the invasion of Crimea. And I was like, okay, we're going to take Russia seriously as a threat now, right? And it just didn't happen. And I'm not sure exactly why. I think it's important to distinguish between negligence and malice. With the Obama administration, they certainly didn't intend for this to happen. But, they didn't do enough to prevent it. With Trump, of course, you have outright malice. You have a purposeful embrace of dictatorship and Kremlin partnership that's enormously dangerous, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. And the only way to remedy this is to just look at it head on, without nostalgia, without excuses, without unnecessary finger pointing and blame, but just figure out, how did so many people, so many intelligent people, screw this up so badly? So that way, hopefully, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and not do that again.
There's an excellent documentary on how did such smart people get blindsided by Putin. And the documentary is called The Final Year. And there's two very disturbing scenes in this documentary. There's a couple, but the two that really stick out to me was two women talking to Ben Rhodes, who, of course, was very influential in Obama's White House in terms of his foreign policy. Ben Rhodes served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications for Obama, and was an advisor on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. He was active on the Iran deal, which I thought was great in spirit, great in intention, but it stretched Obama's foreign policy team too thin when they should have been focusing on Putin. And it just simply didn't have enough teeth to really hold Iran in line. So when all is said and done, I think a lot of this points back to the Iran deal. That was just You don't start renovating your kitchen when your house is on fire. It's like, Putin is coming for you. He's invaded one of his neighbors. He's gunning for you. So you need to contain him through strong, swift sanctions. And you can't trust someone like Putin to negotiate on Syria. The way John Kerry tried to negotiate with the Kremlin, with Lavrov, it reminds me how Democrats try to negotiate with Republicans. There's no negotiating with terrorists. And so I just think it was just in terms of foreign policy, Obama's White House was just stretched too thin, and they cursed themselves by not prioritizing Putin. And Ben Rhodes, with his romanticism, had a lot to do with that. And if you want to see that, watch the documentary The Final Year. As I mentioned, there's a disturbing moment where Ben Rhodes is being asked about Brexit, and somebody asks him, aren't you concerned that Brexit might mean that Trump's going to win? And Ben Rhodes basically shakes it off. No, of course not. And then you flash forward Ben Rhodes on election night when the results come in and Trump is the next president of the United States. Let's all let that sink in once again. Ben Rhodes is just standing there looking like a shocked schoolboy, just saying, yeah, I guess we just underestimated Putin, you think? And meanwhile, Ukrainians were screaming at them saying please, they're going to come for you next. You understand? It's crazy. There's a story of Ukrainian soldiers that thought they negotiated a safe passage with Russian fighters essentially, and instead they got massacred. So when you see Russians doing that, when you see the Kremlin doing that, how can you negotiate with them on anything, on Syria? John Kerry wasted so much time. This is very complicated issues, and a great documentary on Syria alone and Obama's foreign policy is a documentary called Red Lines. Obama said if Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, that would be the red line, and the U.S. would have to act swiftly. Of course, we're not advocating for war, but it was just things like no-fly zones and other things that could have changed things potentially. And
all right, on that note, should we proceed to the interview?
The interview with Michael Weiss that we taped, it was a retrospective of Obama's foreign policy in regards to how it may have contributed to Donald Trump as president of the United States. This was recorded back in August. So just to set it up, just to give people an idea of how asleep his foreign policy team was in regards to Putin, and especially, it was just too late. By the time 2016 came along and the Russians were emboldened and they were really taking a huge gamble in hacking our election, it was just too late by then. And Hayes Brown and BuzzFeed has a fascinating piece called How Russia Hacked Obama's Legacy, which I definitely recommend everyone read. And I'm going to read from a little bit of it. No one from the Obama administration seems to remember when they figured out they were falling victim to one of the greatest intelligence operations in history. This was the kind of realization that came incrementally, a former senior State Department official told BuzzFeed News. Now, as two congressional committees and the FBI investigate Russia's role in the election, former Obama officials find themselves grappling with a new legacy, one that formed at the 11th hour of their time in power. As they look toward a world where pariahs like Iran and Cuba were won over with diplomacy, to some extent, that's my comment, they fell victim to a sneak attack by an old adversary, and they let it happen, offering up stern warnings and finger-wagging instead of adequately punishing Russia for achieving something that even the Soviet Union, at the height of its power, couldn't manage, meddling in the U.S. election and rattling Americans' trust in their democracy. Initially, news that Russia-backed hackers had infiltrated the email systems of the DNC split the Obama administration. White House staffers struggled to wrap their heads around the scale of what occurred and found themselves unsure of how to respond without appearing to give Hillary Clinton a boost. The State Department staff were torn over how far to press the matter with Russia, given other priorities like struggling to find an endgame for the Syrian civil war. Across the Potomac, the Defense Department was pushing for a strong response against Russia. The White House was more in listening mode, a former Defense Department official told BuzzFeed. The official described what ensued as endless discussions after endless discussion. After weeks of intense debate, the White House's ambivalence won. On October 7th, a Friday afternoon, they released a carefully worded 3-paragraph statement saying that the U.S. intelligence community was confident that the Russian government was behind the hack. White House staffers thought publicly blaming Russia would draw the public's attention and keep Moscow in line by making clear the U.S. was willing to call them out. That's hilarious. They also functioned under the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win and take a more robust approach down the line. When we rolled that out on October 7th, we thought this would get a huge amount of pickup and play and be a catalyzing moment for the country when the United States government, the intelligence community, and DHS announced jointly that Russians were trying to hack our election. Ned Price, the chief spokesman for the National Security Council, told BuzzFeed, quote, "A colleague of mine at another department was on the phone with a reporter who was asking him questions about this statement," Price said. "My colleague then recalled hearing from the reporter, 'Oh my God, I'll call you back.' 1 hour after the statement dropped, the Washington Post published a 2005 Grab Them by the Pussy tape. Less than a half hour later, WikiLeaks began dumping a new series of emails, this time hacked from the account of John Podesta, Clinton's campaign chairman. The reporter never called back. Former officials have placed a lot of hype in that statement, the key point of which was that Russia was behind the leaks, something that had been reported for months by cybersecurity companies and journalists during the months since leaving office. But the fact remains that the brief release had been a small shot, and it had missed. And there you have it. That basically sums up what it felt like to be a Ukrainian American or Syrian American and watching people you care about face invasion by the Kremlin, brutality by the Kremlin. I know people that, activists who were, pro-Obama, campaigned for Obama. I knocked on doors for Obama. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like a betrayal, just how reticent he was in his administration prioritizing standing up to Putin. It even got to the point where, I was somebody who was very active in speaking out on Twitter since 2013 on what was really going on in Ukraine. And I faced the barrage of trolls. The first generation of Kremlin trolls that went after us were like nasty. They would call us all sorts of names. And it got to the point where I would speak at places like the World Forum of Democracy. And a Russian would stand up from the audience and pretend to be a Ukrainian and try to get me. No one in the Ukrainian delegation knew who this guy was.
Thank you very much.
Question or small question, yes? Yes.
Well, I have a very simple and short question to put to you, you at the head table. I mean, this forum is called the World Forum for Democracy. But I'm here now for the third day, and I'm seeing you collectively as a panel. We have Andrea from Ukraine, but I don't see democracy there. I mean, you only have people expressing one point of view. There's no alternative. And if Andrea wants the Ukrainian people to live in that kind of democracy, well, I'm a Ukrainian myself, and that kind of democracy, no thank you.
Spasiba.
Thank you.
So it's very obvious to anybody who lives in a country where there's freedom of press and they're able to get diverse sides of the story and objective facts that Ukraine did achieve democracy with Euromaidan. The president who was overthrown passed a series of laws that turned his country into a dictatorship, including making it illegal to investigate people in power, making it illegal to demonstrate in the streets, making it illegal to wear helmets and other gear to protect yourself from the government's riot police who are beating protesters. And there's very strong evidence that there are Russian paramilitary inside Ukraine that were the snipers shooting Ukrainian protesters. So if anybody living in a country, unlike Russia, where there's freedom of press, where there's freedom of the internet, and has been following the issues, what's going on in Ukraine, they know that Ukraine just had a democratic parliamentary election with election observers from around the world who saw an overwhelmingly pro-Western, pro-Europe, pro-democratic parliament elected. So Ukraine's new parliament is 70% pro-West because they don't want to live in a closed society like Russia. Spasiba.
Thank you. So I'm going to take two more questions. I would encourage.
And so I would meet my trolls in person. I spoke at the National Arts Club in 2015 about resistance art in Ukraine. And halfway through my talk, 6 people get up from the audience and just walk out. And the organizer, after apologized to me, she was stunned. Turns out they were from the Russian consulate and the Russian embassy in DC. Like they walked out as a form of protest against my talk. So again and again, I would speak somewhere and I would get confronted by somebody in the audience spouting these Kremlin talking points to me, and I would get harassed online, like viciously harassed online by these troll networks. And I knew that I did not feel safe. I didn't feel like the White House was protecting me. I would meet Michael Weiss, who we're interviewing, and many others. We're on the front lines of an unprecedented information war, and we were sitting ducks. And it got to the point where I remember one day I was working on organizing an event with Russian activists, people who fled Russia. And we're going to do an event in New York City in solidarity with Boris Nemtsov's big march, anti-war march in Moscow. And a few days before the march, Boris Nemtsov was murdered. He was assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin. And our march turned into a vigil. And I had to see my Russian friends with like absolute fear in their eyes. And it was at that moment when I decided to like redouble my efforts to get my film made, because I felt like I had to grab people by the throats and be like, please care about what's happening before it's too late. And I did not feel safe that I actually used my husband's last name on the film because the Kremlin was so good at tracking my movements, tracking my events. Like I did an event for the 1-year anniversary of the revolution in Ukraine called Global Maidan, bringing together producers from Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, Stephen Colbert, and all these other like comedy producers, television producers, for them to share their tips on how human rights activists in Ukraine and Syria and other places can fight for human rights using pop culture. So some weird blog post called it a Ukrainian neo-Nazi event, and how dare Jon Stewart and Colbert send their people to a neo-Nazi gathering in the heart of New York City. So I saw the Kremlin tracking my movements and seeing what I was doing. So I felt like I had to use my husband's last name, almost like two-step notification on your email. So a lot of the reason why if you see any coverage of my film, Gareth Jones, and I have my husband's last name, it's because I didn't feel safe having to go to Poland and Ukraine to work on my film. And I felt like I didn't want my real name on any of the funding papers or other things that would be floating around. And I just wanted to, and I knew that the Kremlin forces were dumb. I've met some of these Russian trolls and Kremlin trolls in person. And so I knew what I was up against. And yeah, it was just a little way of security in an insecure world. And whether it was really helpful or not, I don't know. But that's just how I felt about it at the time.
I think all of the people we've interviewed so far were people who saw this crisis coming, whether it's the two of us or Sadet Harry, who had noticed the troll activity back in 2014, or Barbara Simons with, election integrity and the problem of hacking. And, now you and Michael seeing in advance how the incompetence of the Obama administration on foreign policy could lead to basically having a Kremlin asset in the White House, or it's not the cause of it, but they were unable to effectively stop it in time. And now, unfortunately, everyone is in an unsafe position due to that. So without further ado.
Yeah, well, without further ado, we have to announce a winner. We have a winner of the Gaslit Nation Crush the Midterms Challenge. Every episode leading up to Election Day, November 6th, we're announcing a winner of the Gaslit Nation Challenge. What we want our listeners to do is go to crushthemidterms.org and make your plan in a matter of seconds on how you plan to help create the blue wave. Keep in mind that we're up against a lot of dark money. We're up against a traveling reality show of a president that attracts attention everywhere he goes. So we have to redouble our efforts. And one of the best ways you can do that is by going door to door, canvassing. And it's very easy to do. It's very effective. It's one of the most effective ways you can get out the vote. All you're doing is just showing up on someone's doorstep and smiling, being friendly, and just handing them some campaign lit for whichever candidate or whatever issue you're getting out the vote for. And it sends a very powerful message because, right now in the world, we have this television renaissance. There's shows like The Good Place you could be binge watching. I love that show. Sarah loves that show. There's so many other things you could be doing with your time. And the fact that you're showing up on a stranger's doorstep and being like, I could be watching The Good Place and instead I'm here on your doorstep because that's how much I care about taking back Congress. And that's how much I care about human rights. So it's such a powerful message to go door to door. It's so easy to do. I'm going out today, this evening. Knocking on doors is the new happy hour. I hope you will join me. And you can make your plan, find an election, a campaign that needs you on crushthemidterms.org, tweet your plan at us, and we'll select a winner who will get a signed copy of Sarah's book. And then we're also doing the 1,000 door challenge. I'm trying to knock on 1,000 doors between now and November 6th. And if you're joining me on this soul-changing journey, because it is an adventure, then please tweet a picture of yourself canvassing, tag us at Gaslit Nation, and we're going to have not one, but 3 winners selected from the photos we get to come join our show after the election to share your dreams for our country and how we're going to build a progressive America. So now, Sarah, I'm going to roll the wheel of chance here and tell me when to stop. You love this.
Okay, I do. I truly do.
I'm freaking out. Who is going to get a signed copy of your book?
Okay, stop.
Oh my gosh. Are you ready?
I am.
Are you ready? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, this is great. So triggered liberal, Casey Mellon. We love you, triggered liberal. We're triggered liberals also. That's what this show's about.
Congratulations. Will ease your triggered pain.
Yes.
You're going to be like more triggered after reading the book, but that's okay.
Press Secretary Robert Gibbs phoned President Obama at 6 a.m. with the good but very unexpected news that he was chosen to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. No one saw it coming. The announcement in Oslo in Norwegian drew gasps from the audience.
Many women have been among the protesters on the front lines of anti-government movements in the Middle East and North Africa. They helped topple longtime leaders in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Karen Sherman is the executive director for global programs at Women for Women International.
They played a catalytic role in terms of coming out and organizing protests, smuggling arms, getting information to international media outlets.
After enduring decades of authoritarian governments, the people of several Middle Eastern countries raised their voices in protest and ousted their leaders in what has been called the Arab Spring. In Egypt and Tunisia, the uprisings were quick and decisive. In Libya, the protests led to a short civil war that ended with the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Syria is another story.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
We want to flag for you tonight what may be an emerging genocide. The Islamic Army, known as ISIS, has seized vast territory in Syria and Iraq. And over the weekend, ISIS stormed more towns in northern Iraq.
I am the Ukrainian, the native of Kiev. And now I am on Maidan, on the central part of my city. I want you to know why thousands of people all over my country are on the streets. There is only one reason. We want to be free from a dictatorship. We want to be free from the politicians who work only for themselves, who are ready to shoot, to beat, to injure people just for saving their money, just for saving their houses, just to saving their power.
Violent anti-government protests sparked the Ukrainian revolution and the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. Russian President Vladimir Putin holds a secret meeting about extracting the deposed Yanukovych and annexing Crimea from Ukraine. Heavily armed pro-Russian gunmen occupy the Crimean parliament and allegedly force the emergency instatement of a new pro-Russian prime minister. The new Crimean prime minister takes control of Ukraine's security forces. Russia pledges the use of their armed forces in Ukraine. President Putin tells reporters that the unidentified soldiers occupying Crimean military bases are not Russian, and says that Russia will not try to annex Crimea. A planned referendum to accede Crimea to Russia is condemned by the Ukrainian government, the US and the EU. Russia announces massive military exercises along the Ukrainian border.
The Russian military now being directly involved in fighting Ukrainian government forces.
Satellite imagery show Russian combat units southeast of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine.
Well, the deal came after years of tension over Iran's alleged efforts to build a nuclear bomb. Iran agreed to do away with large parts of its nuclear program and allow international inspectors to monitor what was left. In return, the international community agreed to lift the sanctions, allowing Iran to do business, sell oil, and recover $100 billion of assets frozen in banks abroad. Some people are bothered by the fact that many of the deal's key provisions expire in 10, 15 or 25 years. And Iran's behavior across the Middle East, its involvement in the wars in Syria and Yemen, that's something that bothers almost everyone.
We're here with Michael Weiss, an American journalist and the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror.
He is a consulting executive editor at Coda Story and a frequent national security analyst and contributor for CNN. And before I had Sarah Kendzior, I was in the trenches with Michael Weiss. And as soon as I met Sarah, I'm like, see ya, Michael Weiss.
You have exceptional taste, I have to say.
You're not the first person to trade up on me, Andrea, so it's okay. Don't worry about it.
Michael and I did see each other through some difficult times. And actually, what's really funny is our friendship history tells the story of how America got here at this moment in time with Trump and Russia. And that's, of course, the story through Ukraine and Putin's invasion and, all sort of coming out of that, the revolution in Ukraine. You were working around that time in 2013, 2014. You were the founder, the editor of a wonderful site, The Interpreter, which translated and analyzed media in Russia, a lot of sort of tech happenings, what was going on in social media inside Russia. And that was, interestingly enough, founded by a major opponent to Putin.
Yeah, well, so what happened was I was working at a think tank in the UK and meeting with a lot of what they would call the first generation of Russian emigres from the 90s who were real true blue dissidents and opponents of Putin. And I wanted to do a project that was kind of like, I think the catchphrase we came up with was Ina Pressa in reverse. So Ina Pressa takes American or Western news articles, translates them into Russian so Russians can have a sense of what the Western news cycle is on about all the time. So we wanted to do something similar with the Russian news cycle. And it started out as just whole cloth translations of Kommersant, Novaya Gazeta articles, that kind of thing, which eventually we found was pretty boring. What people wanted was context. They wanted the most relevant aspects or parts of a story, groundbreaking investigative journalism, to be translated and then given, put a little more meat on the bones. So when I got to New York, basically I had a grant for, I think it was $50,000, and I needed a matching grant to get that $50,000. And I was introduced to Pavel Khodorkovsky, who's the son of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian oil tycoon who then became a prime enemy of Putin and was thrown into the Gulag for 10 years or a labor camp for 10 years. His business partners were arrested. Then his company was taken over and then auctioned under extraordinarily dodgy circumstances and, basically became nationalized. There's no question that what he got up to in the 90s was what all these oligarchs did. But he had an insight, a rare one, which was that the future of Russia had to be in the direction of transparency and democracy. And it really did look like, I know one of his fiercest opponents said that he went from being the most corrupt oligarch to being the least corrupt and somebody who wanted to really transform Russia. And all of his efforts since he's been let out of prison have been in this direction of civil society building and so on and so forth. In fact, what his organization, Open Russia, is doing is actually kind of like what WikiLeaks does, but on the right side. They're the ones who are publishing leaked email correspondence of Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer who went to that Trump Tower meeting in 2016 and who I've written a numerous number of articles about, dating back to when she was just working to dismantle the Magnitsky Act and to lift U.S. sanctions on Russia.
I invited you to come on a panel early 2015. Putin was invading Ukraine and Obama's administration, which we'll get into later in this conversation, Ukraine sort of feels left behind. And the focus seems to be clearly the priority is fighting ISIS in the Middle East. Ukraine is begging for weapons, defensive aid, saying, you signed this Budapest Memorandum. We gave up our nukes for it, that you would protect our sovereignty if it should come to that. And so just give us some defensive aid. And Obama was sitting on his hands when it came to this. And it all came down, reportedly, from what we understood, was Susan Rice. So our panel was basically, how do we get through to Susan Rice?
It came down to the Obama administration coming to office, trying to undo the disaster of George W. Bush. Noble intentions in many respects. I mean, the Iraq War is still the biggest strategic and moral disaster of U.S. foreign policy and since World War II, frankly. But the misassumption they made, and this was part of the so-called reset, was that, look, we can deal with Russia transactionally. The era of zero-sum geopolitics is over. They're not in a Cold War mentality. We're certainly not. At worst, they'll be a nuisance for us, but a nuisance that we can negotiate ourselves around. And under Medvedev, I mean, one could make the argument that the optics were there. This was a guy, a technocrat, not a KGB case officer like Putin. He liked Deep Purple and Western rock bands, but he was a loyal Putinist going back, I think, a decade when Putin worked in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. And let's be honest, Medvedev didn't wield any actual power. Putin was still the man in charge. This guy was just the public face to the West. And I think that the big mistake was, look, Russia decided, okay, so let's put on this kind of liberal lip gloss, for lack of a better term, and deal with the Americans to get what we want, which is access to the World Trade Organization. We want foreign direct investment from the United States. We want U.S. pressure off our backs when it comes to our quasi-monopoly on energy in Europe. The big problem was that the regime fundamentally had not changed. And in fact, one could even make the case, and I would, a lot of the consolidation of the security apparatuses, the rise of the Siloviki, the former KGB officer class who had now attained unprecedented levels of power. A lot of that actually accelerated under the Medvedev placeholder presidency. That didn't really get much notice and press attention in the West, but it was happening internally in Russia. Then, of course, you have the stolen Duma elections in 2011. You have what becomes the Bolotnaya protest movement, the largest demonstration in Russia since the collapse of communism, not violently suppressed, although certainly there were acts of provocation and there were sporadic acts of violence, but suppressed in a very clever postmodern dictatorial way, branding the opposition as paid agents of the State Department and the CIA, claiming that they were the real crooks and thieves. Alexei Navalny and his brother, who went to prison for several years, had defrauded Russian companies, et cetera, et cetera. But really what this represented at that point in particular, because remember, the real turn, Putin was never a fan of the United States, but he thought he could get something out of us by appearing to be a partner and a cooperator on counterterrorism and counter-organized crime and so on and so forth. The real turn for him when he became publicly nasty was 2004 during the colored revolutions in Eastern Europe. That for him was a hinge moment because he genuinely believes, or he has been led to believe, that the U.S. State Department, the CIA, the U.S. government writ large is undergoing these acts of regime change all around Europe. NATO expansionism. Why is NATO creeping up into our backyard or right up to our border? 2004, of course, is the year that the Baltic states accede to NATO, which literally is on the Russian border. Now, the way that Putin characterizes all this is not that accession into NATO is a voluntary act, a quite difficult one on the part of aspiring member states. It's not like NATO is this hegemon that greedily gobbles up countries that don't want to be part of it. No, countries aspire to be part of NATO. It takes years. They have to meet certain requirements, defense spending requirements. Their military has to be up to certain codes. They have to be democracies, et cetera, et cetera. But again, for Putin, it's a giant Western conspiracy led by the United States. Now, all of these things I can point to. 2008, I believe the Russian defense doctrine, and Lilia Shevtsova, who's a great liberal journalist and actually more of an analyst on Russian affairs, always points this out. She's like, there was no mystery about what Putin and the Russian government wanted, at least as of 2008. Embedded in the defense doctrine is containment of the United States and the undercutting of U.S. interests abroad. Full stop. Well, what does that mean? It means that Russia is sort of in another state of Cold War with America. And yes, we see this most starkly in Ukraine. Again, people are very ill-informed about the origins of the Euromaidan revolution, and certain facts that you present to them are absolutely mind-boggling. For instance, Viktor Yanukovych, the guy who actually resigned from power and fled like a thief in the night to Moscow with as much stolen money as he could muster, ran for office, ran for president in 2010 on a platform of integration with the European Union, specifically that Ukraine would sign the so-called association agreement, bringing Ukraine closer to the West. The Party of Regions, Yanukovych's party, they had EU flags, or the colors of the EU flag, intertwined with the colors of the Party of Regions banner during that election. People forget this. Why the people turned against him was because he essentially accepted an enormous bribe from Putin to tear up that agreement, to renege on his campaign pledge. Wasn't ousted. There was no junta. The U.S. effort, or the U.S. intervention in Ukraine, if you can even call it that, was one of conciliation and de-escalation. The U.S. role was to get Yanukovych to accede to some of the protesters' demands, but to basically call for early elections. So in other words, not regime change, not the ouster of the president. Let's just speed up the next popular vote to determine who's going to lead the country. And that was a plan that was agreed to by the European Union, the United States, another party, Ukraine, and the protesters, of course, and the Russian government was itself a party to this. Yanukovych violated this agreement by fleeing the country and essentially de facto resigning his position, even though he claimed that he was still the duly elected president of Ukraine. Also, he violated this agreement by sending Ukrainian police forces and security forces into the streets to shoot civilians, to shoot people in the head, to shoot them dead. So it was an act of violence by the state.
Corruption accelerated, it deepened under Yanukovych, and he also was very adept at weakening Ukraine's military. So in early 2015, when you and I are on a panel at the Ukrainian Museum, we're giving people a overview of what Ukraine is up against, being invaded by the second most powerful military in the world after their military has been largely hobbled by corruption under Yanukovych. And it's not that either of us are at all pro-war by any means. We're just unpacking for people Obama's foreign policy and how it was impacting things. And the question was that kept getting raised in the conversation was, how do you get through to Susan Rice? Because she was sort of seen as the one that was one of the key people that was preventing Obama from giving defensive aid to Ukraine, something that Congress was united over.
The issue for this administration, and it wasn't just Susan Rice, it was the president himself. In fact, a very good source of mine told me at the time that Joe Biden had gone out to lunch with John McCain, and McCain, stalwart foreign policy hawk, stalwart Republican internationalist, said to him, "I don't understand why we're not giving Javelin anti-tank missiles and other defensive military weapons to the Ukrainian army." And Biden's response, according to the source, was, "John, there's only one man in the country who thinks that's a bad idea, and he's the president of the United States." There was not really a coherent or strategic foreign policy in the Obama administration for term 2, bar one thing. And that one thing was getting the Iranian nuclear accord done.
But I want to build up to this fateful night when you and I are on a panel at the Ukrainian Museum. And so this room is absolutely packed. And so at the end of the night, you have people hanging around him trying to say hello. And they all sort of disperse finally. But there's one young college-age girl that's hanging around. And I think nothing of it. We think nothing of it. And so we go to a bar in the area, and she sticks around, and she's sort of hovering. And again, I'm not really giving her much thought. And Michael is holding court at one end of the bar. I'm standing at the bar with a friend, and this girl comes up to me because I was a moderator on the panel. She says to me, "I have a plan on how to end the war in Ukraine quickly and bring economic stability to Ukraine." And I'm like, okay. And this is where the red flag really shoots up. She says, "Who can you introduce me to so I can talk about my plan?" Now, at this point, I'm used to people coming up to me saying, "I have this brilliant idea. Now here it is, you go do it." And so the fact that she wants me to introduce her to someone for her brilliant idea, I don't normally hear that. This is a bit odd. So I ask her, I'm like, "Well, do you know, let's see, a good person to talk to would be maybe Alia Chandra at Euromaidan PR." And she looks at me, she's like, "What's that?" I'm like, "Okay, wait, you have a plan on how to save Ukraine, yet you don't know the main Facebook page that was used to organize in the revolution, founded in part by a young man, a young activist from Ukraine who was profiled on 60 Minutes. That's where we all got our news from the activists on the ground in the heart of fiery Kiev. You don't know that page." Okay. Well, I asked her, I'm like, "Well, do you know so-and-so at Hromadska TV? She's like, "What's that?" So I'm going down the list of all the news sources that people typically follow for Ukrainian news that's like really on the ground stuff. She doesn't know any of it. And I'm like, "Well, where do you get your news from on Ukraine?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm from Chicago." I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's a big Ukrainian community there." And she's like, "Yeah, I get my news from Ukrainian diaspora newspapers in Chicago." I'm like, "Oh really, which one?" She couldn't name a single one. And I'm like, "Oh, that's funny. You have a plan on how to save Ukraine, yet you don't know any of these people or these sites that I'm listing." And so I lean over to Michael Weiss and I say to him, I'm like, "Hey, Michael, that girl that was hanging around you, giving each person on the panel a box of chocolates, she doesn't know what Hromadska TV is." And right away, Michael knew exactly what I was talking about. And his face went pale. He looked at me. He's like, "I gave that girl my phone number."
Well, now, hang on. Now you make me look sketchy. She said, "Oh, I'm interested in Ukraine, and it'd be great to talk to you at length, and blah blah blah." And fine, here, this is my phone number.
I have to pretend I'm drunk, take her phone, and be like, "Yeah, sure, I'll give you my number, no problem," because she asked for my number. And so I start going into her phone and looking up Michael's name, deleting his cell phone number, putting some fake number in. I put in a fake number for myself, and I asked her to write down her name so I can, reach out to her later. So she writes it down. And I go the next day and I Google her. and I find a Google Plus profile, and it's her photo, and it looks like an FBI photo, and this penetrating gaze, and the text describing who she is the most generic text. Like, I like long walks on the beach. I like coffee. I like technology. Like, so generic. One thing about the Russians during this time is their social media strategy was so in your face ridiculous. Like, they would just flood the comment sections of articles that were critical of Putin with like all these broken English, attacking the reporter, attacking the article. And so her original name was still in the URL of the Google Plus profile. So I grabbed that and Googled her original name, and I found all these anti-Ukrainian comments that she was leaving on mainstream news sites. My thinking is, at this time, Preet Bharara, then the Manhattan U.S. attorney, he had just busted a Russian spy ring in New York City. And one of the things that these news reports pointed out was that the Russian spies are eavesdropping over, that the feds were listening in on. They were complaining about how difficult it was to recruit local college girls to go in and into these events and collect intel on them. And I'm thinking, yeah, no kidding. I've met one of these girls probably. I know how amateurish they are. So the Russians have a history of mapping us, mapping how our systems work, getting an understanding of the lay of the land. And if you look at sort of how they take advantage of that, it's really to look at our weaknesses. And so I strongly felt that night that was somebody who was sent around, because this was a high profile event. You're a high profile expert on what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. You were linked to one of Putin's top opponents. And this was an event on how to arm Ukraine, which is something that Russia simply does not want. Hence, we saw the change in Ukraine's platform in 2016 under the Republicans of the RNC, et cetera.
Well, let's assume that this interpretation is true and that she's an agent or something. The worst they would do is get my phone number and therefore possibly hack my phone or listen to my conversations, which would consist largely of me and you talking about the things that we're now talking about on this podcast. So I'm actually the most boring person in the world for any foreign government to spy on, because I usually end up saying publicly what I say privately. But it's this kind of like weird cloak and dagger, shadowy world of doing journalism amidst foreign agents and spies and all that. One unintended consequence of it is that it's actually contributed to the stability of my marriage, because I just tell my wife, I suspect a woman is romantically or sexually interested in me, I know that she's a Russian spy, so you have nothing to worry about for the sake of my own security. And, that's the biggest trust builder that we've got going right now. So there you go. Thank you for saving me from potential SVR recruitment, Andrea.
So I just want to say I appreciate all the moral support you've given me over the years, because it's been rough, because we were on the front lines of an unprecedented, aggressive information war. We were getting viciously attacked.
In 2015, Russia directly intervenes in Syria. And what I started to notice was that whereas before you'd see some trolling and some comments, it really kind of opened the floodgate. And now looking back with all the knowledge we have, thanks to Robert Mueller and reporting that's been done, how many of these people are real people? How many of them are just genuinely ideologically committed to protecting Russia from the American juggernaut, or believe that there's this vast neoconservative conspiracy to frame Putin for being a kleptocratic thug and all the rest of it. But yeah, what I didn't note at the time, the proliferation of the alt-right, basically neo-Nazism, and its sort of cheek by jowl partnership with the Russian government and Russian state and non-state actors, really kind of frightening. Well, I used to do this game where I'd retweet anti-Semitic trolls, just retweet them, and they keep going for the attention. And then people would laugh and say, oh my God, this is, and then people started saying, we follow you to get news or information or your opinion. I would why are you doing this? I'm because I want you to see what this kind of work engenders. Look at Jessica Aro. This was a Finnish investigative reporter who, she wasn't just trolled online. They called her phone, they sent text messages purporting to be from her dead father. They really tried to destroy this woman's life, both personally and professionally. It's disgusting, and it's designed to demoralize you into shutting up and not doing this stuff.
It's such a bizarre world that we're in, and it's hard to relate to. And I want to say that one of my favorite moments was I was flipping through the channels on TV, and I stop on Bill Maher, at the exact moment you are fact-checking some right-wing pundit who is spitting out the Trump administration's lies that my sister worked with Ukraine.
Ralph Reed, he was claiming like the Black Ledger on Manafort was bullshit and hadn't been substantiated. Of course, now it's been substantiated and Mueller's going to jail for 200 years. There's this whole kind of meta phenomenon taking place where, and you guys are privy to it, you're subject to it because you're on Twitter and you're online. What's a Russia expert versus who's a fake expert and who really has the authority to comment on this stuff and blah, blah, blah. And liberals have to appreciate this. Active measures, Russian disinformation campaigns, Russian propaganda, they would not have succeeded without American relays and without people who were ideologically sympathetic to the message, whether or not they believed in the veracity of the message, and also people who are just fucking stupid. The moronic inferno of American politics, which is one of the reasons the Russians thought, right, now's the time we can do this. The culture has changed so dramatically after the Tea Party, after the rise of the alt-right, and after the 2008 economic implosion. Whereas before, these things, these cockamamie conspiracy theories, InfoWars, RT and Sputnik, claiming that the Pope is a space alien and, Ebola is a CIA bioweapon. All of these things might have just been on the fringes of society. They've now become the mainstream. And that, to me, is the scariest thing. The guy who said this best is the head of Estonia's domestic security service. They go after the quote-unquote human rights activists who steal across the border from St. Petersburg and then dress up as neo-Nazis pretending to be Estonian neo-Nazis when they're... So, they really anatomize this stuff beautifully. And he's like, look, be educated, be literate when it comes to Russian influence operations, but also just be media savvy and media literate. Stop being so fucking gullible, do a little due diligence, be skeptical of the things that you read and try to find out the provenance of them. And that's something that unfortunately the FBI ain't going to help us with. That goes down to the bone, the DNA of what America is now.
And how absurd has it been for us seeing our little corner of the world become, the biggest news story today with sort of, I've said on a podcast that the election of Donald Trump feels like the sequel to Ukraine's revolutions.
Yeah, well, Ukraine, Syria, the Baltic states, these were trial balloons for what for the big show, which was what they did here. And they wouldn't have done it unless they had had some success elsewhere. And it's important to remember, I've gone to all these meetings over the last couple of years, think tank conferences, State Department meetings, meetings with politicians here, there, everywhere, as have you guys, I'm sure. One of the things that strikes me the most, though, is America likes to be the moral and strategic tutor to other countries, particularly former Soviet-occupied countries. But when it comes to Russian disinformation campaigns, we have a lot to learn from what the Estonians, the Lithuanians, and the Ukrainians have found out at firsthand, and a lot to learn from the antibodies they built up to this stuff. Where is the American Stop Fake, for instance? Yevhen's outfit in Kyiv. We don't really have. PolitiFact, kind of, but that's focused on lies being told domestically by Americans more than it is on foreign actors. We need some. And one of the things that I suggested, and I know this didn't go down very well in some of the cooler precincts of online Russia watching, is that major media organizations need a kind of ombudsman for disinformation, right? The best trick that the Russians have to play is preying upon American journalists' sense of even-handedness, fair and balanced reporting. So if the Russian foreign ministry says something, even if it's the moon is made of cheese, that gets reported as though it were on par information-wise with a U.S. denial or debunking or a fact coming from a more credible source. And after what point do you say, right, here's a government that pathologically lies in a contradictory fashion, makes up absurdities. The lie told on Monday is logically incongruent with the lie that's told on Tuesday. In fact, it debunks the lie that's told on Tuesday, and so on and so forth. At what point do you say, right, enough is enough? We're not going to present this stuff like it's all the news that's fit to print. We're going to call it what it is, which is a lie. And ironically, what's happening is American journalism is doing that with respect to Trump, right? We're doing that with respect to our own politicians, but we're still hesitant or reluctant to do it with respect to foreign governments. And as an international affairs correspondent, the latter is as significant and as important to me as the former. I say, listen to Ukrainian civil society, Estonian, Latvian civil society, Lithuanians. These guys were on the front lines pushing back against Russian trolls. They even created their own little species, Lithuanian elves. People who just got together on Google Hangouts and decided, obviously these are bots or these are trolls peppering credible news sites with comments of bullshit, disinformation, anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-American. So they just gang together and push back against them online. But as you know, Andrea, and you, Sarah, too, it's exhausting, unless you have really a force of numbers behind you, unless you have sort of organized counter disinformation campaigns. This stuff you could spend the rest of your life swatting away falsehood after falsehood and really never get anywhere, right? Because it's designed to exhaust you.
And where was, the Obama administration and all this? So could you speak a little bit about sort of looking back now, how their foreign policy and who specifically contributed to this moment of how we got here?
It wasn't a priority. The Iran deal is to term 2 what Obamacare was to term 1. So these are the 2 signature legacy accomplishments of the administration. The administration will move heaven and earth to make sure the Iran deal gets done. And by moving heaven and earth, I mean it will forfeit, it will sacrifice, in their minds, lower order priorities, such as the war in Syria, without Moscow's help, does not get solved, according to the U.S. government. The war in Ukraine. Well, we don't want to antagonize the Russians too much. We don't want to run guns to the Ukrainian military, because that may mean that Putin will back away from the P5+1 negotiations or not come to our aid when we need him to certify or to fully realize this nuclear arms agreement. For Obama, bringing Iran in from the cold was more than just about putting a safeguard on its nuclear program. He had a more utopian conceit, which was, this is going to create greater regional stability. This is going to create an equilibrium between the 2 major powers in the region, non-Israel, that is, Saudi Arabia and Iran. They will lie down like lions and lambs together. Sunni and Shia will get along, and we will have ended this, Pax Americana, which has only contributed to more chaos and more bloodshed. Listen to what they said. Listen to what Obama told Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic. Listen to what he told David Remnick in The New Yorker. The idea was, Iran is a rational actor. We hope that they will stop spreading chaos and sort of dial down the state-sponsored terrorism and all the rest of it. And of course, they didn't do that. And they didn't do that for the same reason that Russia didn't withdraw from the Donbass, and that Russia hasn't pulled its forces out of Crimea, and that Russia, has stopped bombing hospitals and civilians in Syria, which is, in the absence of American assertiveness, as cumbersome and as destructive as that assertiveness can be, you don't create equilibrium, you create a vacuum of power. And the vacuum of power is filled by hostile foreign actors who behave much more destructively than the United States does on its worst day. The region has never been more chaotic than it is now, meaning the Middle East. And the perception of the United States there has never been more dire and almost dismissive as it is today. And this is the reason. If you want to get something done in Egypt or Syria or Saudi, the first stop is Moscow before Washington. And that's unprecedented in the last 50 years. I like Obama. I would much rather he were still president now, but I'm not an ideologue. I'm not a partisan. I can't uneducate myself from what I have educated myself into, to knowing, covering the Syria conflict over the last 7 years, and then covering the war in Ukraine and what might have been done. It's impossible to traffic in counterfactuals as a historian. If we only did X, then Y would have resulted? No. But when you say we did X and Y resulted, that's just history, being a dutiful student of current events. And I don't know, does anyone have a good case to make that Obama's foreign policy was an unmitigated success, or even on whole a success? Apart from the Iran deal, which is now torn asunder because of Trump, what's left? Syria in ruins, Ukraine still occupied, and Russia resurgent everywhere. Look at what just happened in Africa to Khodorkovsky-funded investigative journalists who were tracking the Wagner mercenaries who have been deployed before there to Ukraine and to Syria. It's not a fine bill of health by any stretch of the imagination.
And it's sad because, he really obviously did a lot of great work domestically.
Sure.
But his legacy is now being undone because he didn't have a stronger foreign policy.
Right.
Do you see us shifting now? I hate to use this term because it sounds so dumb, but like a new world order. Who's going to emerge now? Our allies are confused about who's in charge, and people just feel like they have to go it alone now.
I have this internal debate with myself about this all the time. Some days I think That's it. The American century is well and truly gone and buried, and what Trump has done is irrevocable, and we're never going to recover from this. On other days, I think, okay, so even under Donald Trump, he decides in retaliation for the use of Assad's chemical weapons use in Syria, he's going to lob missiles at Syrian military installations. And do the Russians threaten World War III? Is anyone there to stop the United States and France and the UK from doing this? No. So there's still a lot of potential energy in what the U.S. can do. I mean, we still are the world's only superpower. We have a GDP. I mean, Russia's GDP is, I think, the size of New York State, maybe a little less. So, I mean, it's just a matter of being strategically wise, having the kind of leadership where we don't abandon our allies. And by the way, abandoning our allies or not meeting them even halfway was a problem under the last administration. Now it's not just a problem. I mean, it's a sort of petulant display of rancor on the part of a fucking man-child, right? But these things can be corrected, I think. It's going to take some time. And unfortunately, I mean, you guys might disagree, I don't think he's going to lose re-election in 2020. I'm not confident of that. I wish I were, but I'm not. And if the economy performs as it has been and even improves, I think most Americans, like the stuff that we've been talking about, nobody cares. Nobody really cares. They care when planes fly into buildings.
One issue that really breaks my heart is, where did we go wrong in Syria? What could have been done differently in Syria under Obama?
There was a point in 2012 and even up to 2013 after the chemical attack in Ghouta. And let me just dispel some shibboleths that get thrown out by, well, first the Obama administration and now the far right, the far left, and just anti-interventionists. You do not have two choices as a superpower between full-on regime change and occupation a la Iraq and Afghanistan, or no-fly zones, humanitarian intervention a la Bosnia and Kosovo. And even between those two options, I mean, there is an entire spectrum of things that can be done. Now, you can say, well, the U.S. ran guns through the CIA to the Free Syrian Army. Yes, they did, but they didn't run the kind of guns that would have been game-changing in the war. And the purpose of that program was not to really bleed Assad or defeat him militarily or to even liberate more terrain. It was to force him to the negotiating table. But he knew, because rebels were saying it, they were telling me at the time, that every time the rebels started to succeed and actually push the regime back, the weapons and ammunition spigots were turned off by the CIA at the behest of the administration. So America was basically telegraphing its true intent. We don't want a conflict in Syria. We see this as kind of an inconvenience and a distraction. Assad must go, but we're not going to do anything to facilitate it. We don't really know who the good guys are in this conflict, who is the opposition. Remember doctors and pharmacists and dentists in Obama's famous formulation, leaving aside the fact that every Syrian male has done military service because they have a conscription army. So it was all this excuse making. And then it became a policy of regime preservation, right? And again, just listen to U.S. officials. Preserving state institutions in Syria was a priority. Well, what kind of state institutions? The Mukhabarat, the security services, which arrest and torture political dissidents and are now delivering the names of the dead, going back to 2011 to the survivors and the family members of those victims. The army and the military, the Praetorian Guard forces, the Republican Guard and the 4th Armored Division, led by Bashar al-Assad's sociopathic brother Maher al-Assad. I mean, these guys were complicit in some of the worst war crimes and crimes against humanity. So it became a game of how do we negotiate this guy out of power, but leave the system that he commands in place, which itself was already a declaration of defeat. And it was one that was seized upon by the Russians and the Iranians. I mean, in fact, Fred Hoff, who was a U.S. ambassador at large at the State Department, really running the Syria program, quit in disgust over the Obama administration's handling of this. He said at one point that his job also included doing a track 2 diplomacy with the Iranians over the nuclear deal. And one of his counterpart, in fact, on the Iranian side said to him, after the 2013 chemical weapon attack, which crossed Obama's famous red line and which everyone thought the United States would finally intervene against Assad in that conflict for, the Iranians like, we couldn't believe that America backed away from this. We were shocked. We thought it was all over for Assad after he did that. And now we realize, it's because this administration wanted an arms deal with us more than they wanted to paper over or to repair a humanitarian catastrophe. But again, Syria is in many ways patient zero for a lot of our current unpleasantness. It led to the refugee crisis, which has in turn galvanized the populist far right in Europe, arguably galvanized Donald Trump here. He was focused on Mexican immigrants, but remember his comments about ISIS and we don't know who's coming in and his Muslim ban. I mean, all of these things had a direct correlation to the catastrophe in Syria. Destabilized Turkey. Turkey is led by an authoritarian thug, very similar to Putin in many ways, but I will say, having reported from there, that their treatment of refugees really makes the United States and other countries look deficient, and their own sovereignty, their own national security was at stake because of the Syria crisis. We patted them on the head and said, sorry, we're not going to help you do what needs to be done, which is create a buffer zone at the border. I can go on and on about all the countries we turned against or we neglected because, again, A1 priority, Iran deal. And talk to the Gulf states about this, talk to the Israelis about this, whoever you like, the Europeans, the French. Francois Hollande left office still incensed over the fact that John Kerry called him at the 11th hour and said, you have to pull your fighter planes out of the sky. We're not actually bombing Syria over the chemical attack.
So where are we now with Syria? It seems like it's just been leveled by Russia, by Putin and Assad.
I mean, the regime has retaken Daraa, which was the cradle of the revolution or the cradle of the uprising, and they retook it because the rebels that the U.S. and other countries were backing in the south were told, we don't have your back. So they were abandoned and the regime swept in. The next province they have their sights on is most certainly Idlib, unless they cut some kind of cynical deal with Turkey that allows Idlib to become almost a de facto annexed territory of Turkey. But the country is balkanized. I mean, Turkey is occupying a wide swath of territory in northern Aleppo, as well as several key cities in Aleppo province. The U.S. is occupying maybe a third, maybe a little less territory east of the Euphrates River. This is the so-called Jazeera, where U.S. proxies are now continuing to fight ISIS and expunge them from territory there. But Assad has regained control of a large portion of the country, certainly what he would call useful Syria, which is the capital, the coast, and the direct line of communications needed to transfer weapons and men across the border into Lebanon for the sake of Hezbollah, which is another Iranian client or proxy.
Assad gets to stay, but he'll be forever beholden to the Kremlin.
He'll be forever beholden to the Kremlin, and Assad has mortgaged his country for the sake of victory. And the difficulty is, I mean, I've reported a little bit on this, and I'm sure more of it will come to light as time goes on. The Russians aren't writing blank checks. The Russians are saying, right, we saved your bacon, now we want a cut of the action. So the Russians are going to pour in with their typical kleptocratic reconstruction deals, the son of Gennady Timchenko or, the Rotenberg brothers will come in and do their thing. And, it'll be like what happens domestically in Russia. But the point is, yes, Assad has lost control in all significant substantive respects of Syria, and he's now wholly reliant. I mean, he's got two crutches. One is called Iran, the other is called Russia. And if Iran were to befall a revolution, which is probably not likely, although likelier now than it has been at any point in the last 10 years, given the continuing protests and given the economic state of the Islamic Republic, and given the fact that U.S. is now reinstituting sanctions that were lifted because of the Iran deal, where does that leave Assad? Then wholly reliant on Russia. And as one quote unquote former Russian diplomat, I think you know what I mean when I say that, put it to me, Russia has no strategic purpose in Syria without Iranian ground forces, Hezbollah and IRGC militias in particular. The Syrian army is largely a spent force. And if the Iranians did pull out of Syria, and this is why I think the Israelis are, whatever the fuck they're smoking, I want some. They think that Putin can negotiate Iran's withdrawal from Syria. If that happened, Russia's intervention in Syria would collapse. And the Russians would be the first to tell you that privately. So that whole thing is a complete sort of non-starter. So yeah, I mean, you essentially have a virtually occupied state in Syria by two foreign countries, Russia and four if you count Turkey. It's not a state in any reasonable sense of the word. And the war, although it is true that it's winding down as Assad gains more territory, it's not over. You still have people with guns. You still have Al-Qaeda. You still have Islamist militias. You still have defectors from the regime or defectors from various rebel groups. You still have ISIS in Deir Zor. We haven't heard the last of this conflict. The only difference is ISIS is no longer mowing over people at Christmas at bazaars in Berlin or down the West Side Highway, at least not at the rate they used to do in 2015 to 2017. So it's out of the news cycle.
Should we give Obama credit for that he did prioritize fighting ISIS, and we don't really hear from them much these days.
He prioritized fighting ISIS. The rise of ISIS caught him so unaware. Because for him, remember the famous line to, again, David Remnick, these guys are the JV team of jihad. They didn't have it all over Al-Qaeda. He was focused preternaturally on Al-Qaeda in the AfPak theater, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and some of the African countries. Didn't really care, thought ISIS was sort of a busted flush. That's the old insurgency from Iraq, and Iraq is now a more or less stable government under Nouri al-Maliki. So it caught him by surprise. It distracted him from what he was really going after, which is, again, this deal with Tehran. And his policy in defeating the caliphate, so-called, I guess you could argue was successful, but my counter-argument to that is, yes, but killing the bad guys, flushing them out of cities and urban populations, we've done that before. We've done that innumerable times before, ever since we invaded and occupied Iraq. The long-term problem here are the forces that get unleashed in your scorched earth counterterrorism campaign. And what we have done in the prosecution of this war is enabled the rise of Iranian fifth columnists in Iraq who run various militia groups, many of them committing human rights abuses as bad as what ISIS has done, according to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. And these guys are now jockeying to be political actors, similar to what Hezbollah has done in Lebanon. That's not good for Iraq. That's not good for the region. Certainly not good for the United States, which has lost all power and most of its credibility in Iraq. And again, this is a country we invaded. And as the Pottery Barn metaphor goes, we broke it, we owned it. Now Iran owns it. So well done, America. And yeah, Russia's influence is still ever present there. I mean, in Baghdad, the Russians liaise regularly with the Iranian intelligence services, Iraqi intelligence services, Hezbollah, and these Iranian-built Iraqi militias to run their own show, completely independent and removed from the U.S. prosecuted war.
John Bolton's in the White House now. He really wants his war with Iran. Iran and Russia are allies. What do you sort of see happening there in terms of all the saber-rattling that the Trump White House is doing against Iran?
Trump has this sort of hawkish, anti-Iran perspective. He still has an overriding worldview, which is that the Middle East is a mess. We don't know what's going on. Does anyone know what's going on? I want out. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to send my constituents to die in wars in the desert, and just let's wash our hands of it and let the Saudis figure it all out. And that's not a strategy. That's essentially defeatism wrapped up in the banner of triumphalism. John Bolton is somebody who is very skeptical about intervening in Syria. I don't know where he is on that now, probably still skeptical because we're not really intervening apart from fighting a war against ISIS. When it comes to Iran, I think their goal now is economic warfare. Sanctions, create hyperinflation, make the value of the rial drop, hoping that that prompts, if not revolution on the streets, then some reconsideration of Iranian behavior. But it ain't going to do that. If anything, the Iranians are going to dig in more. And when it comes to their foreign operations, which is what America is really concerned with from a national security point of view, has Qasem Soleimani gone into early retirement? No. He's still fighting proxy wars in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, lobbing missiles, allowing the Houthis to lob missiles into Saudi Arabia on a routine basis, getting up to no good in other countries in the Middle East and probably beyond Europe, for instance, through Hezbollah and Iranian spies and operatives there. So no, that's again, it's a sort of tactical pantomime policy masquerading as grand strategy. And Bolton and Trump and his entire cabinet, as far as I can tell, at least the people remaining, suffer from what I would call Michael Flynn derangement syndrome, which is the path to peace for America is lie down with the Russians and we will solve the problem of radical jihad, be it Sunni or Shia. Abso-fucking-lutely not. Completest, that is the dumbest idea advanced in first the 2016 election cycle and now being circulated around in foreign policy shops. It's not going to happen. I told you before why it can't happen, because Putin, whether he likes the Iranians or not, is reliant upon them to solidify his gains in the region. And it's a great opportunity for Putin to say, oh, yeah, let's entertain this theory. Come to Moscow, prostrate yourselves before me. Let me interrogate the former ambassador to Russia. Let me interrogate Bill Browder. Let me interrogate DHS special agents and everybody else I want. And we'll keep talking about me getting Iranians out of Syria. Meanwhile, he's just laughing because it's not going to go anywhere. And what shocks me, though, is the Israelis seem to have fallen for this ploy. because they usually know better.
What can be done in terms of foreign policy by the US and the EU to contain Putin?
In a weird way, it may vindicate my earlier prescription before the interference in the US election, but in another way, it kind of complicates that prescription. According to Russian journalists, what motivated Putin to hack the DNC and to wage this influence operation? The Panama Papers. And what did the Panama Papers disclose? His longtime buddy, Mr. Roldugan, a concert cellist, is a billionaire on paper, and the money that he's holding is really money held in reserve for Vladimir Putin. So in other words, going after Putin's personal wealth so aggravated him that he decided to declare a kind of soft war on the United States. And yet, that betrays his Achilles heel, doesn't it? I mean, yes, we should be doing all of the conventional things, beefing up NATO, getting countries to spend 2-3% on their defense spending as members, sending troops, material, rotating forces in and out of Eastern Europe. All of those things are great and necessary. But I think at the level of information warfare, at the level of really kind of driving a stick up his ass, it would be, hey, this is how much this guy's worth. And here's where we show you where the money is. In the chateaus and chalets and the Swiss bank accounts and the Cypriot and BVI offshore entities that have been created. He'll go nuts. And he's not going to go nuts in the sense of, I'm going to launch nukes at the United States. This is another shibboleth that sort of proponents of conciliation with Russia like to advance. We're at the brink of World War III. To which I say, when the Russians pull their kids out of British boarding schools and liquidate all their assets and holdings in the West, then you can be worried about Russia sending atomic bombs into the West. But until and unless that happens, they're not that stupid, and that's not an option. But yeah, we have a whole arsenal of things at our disposal that I think we haven't used even a fraction of the tools. And again, we're not talking about conventional military engagement or confrontation. Full stop, because people like to say, oh, this means going to war with Russia. It doesn't. It doesn't. It means amplifying the things that we're already doing, but just doing a little more strategically and with better sense of what the pressure points of the system are. There is no Kremlin ideology. You could argue that anti-Americanism is the posture. It's the sort of fallback position for everything. But there's not an ideology like there used to be with the Soviet Union. So if you're not fighting a fundamentally ideological opponent, you have to say, what does that opponent really care about? And the one thing, time and time again, Surkov's court jester, postmodern, Derridian hijinks, all come to dust when it comes down to going after the money, right? If you go after the money, the lupine grin on their face morphs into a look of absolute terror and dejection. And going after oligarchs, okay, that's driven the oligarchs closer to Putin, and there's been a rallying effect opposite to that which was intended. But then again, not always. Going after Deripaska makes him divest from Rusal. That was pretty targeted and pretty clever, I thought. Go after more of the oligarchs. Those are the public faces of Putin's kleptocracy. Hit them, and you end up hitting him, and then go after his own money. And I refuse to believe with the vast resources at the disposal of America's intelligence community. I mean, look at what Robert Mueller fucking put together in that indictment, those 12 GRU operatives. How does he know all of that? I refuse to believe that the US government doesn't know where some of Putin's ill-gotten gains are buried. I refuse.
Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. And our editor is Nick Torres.
We were gifted a new transition song by Demian Arriaga, who first told Sarah and I to get a podcast. Thank you for that, Demian, and thank you for your lovely song, Chasing Shibuya.
If you want to help us, leave a review on iTunes. Every review helps us build our audience.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Ann Marshall, Arena Guardia, Ethan Mann, Jennifer Slavic, Peter Case, Rhonda White, Timothy Michael Wilson. Thank you so much. We could not do this show without you. Thanks for listening.